Maren Elwood had long ago accepted the peculiar ache of being unnoticed, the way people's gazes slid past her, as though she were part of the stone walls or the weathered floorboards of Ravonsmere, a servant shaped by shadows and silent corridors, never meant to disturb the world she kept running. She had never expected anything different from life, never imagined that invisibility could feel like a wound, or that one night's breath of lantern light could tear it open. But the moment it happened, swift, impossible, unforgettable, she felt her entire existence tilt, as though the earth beneath her had finally decided she had been hidden long enough. It began on one of those wind-stilled evenings when the air felt thick with unsaid things. Maren slipped out behind the kitchens after her final duties, her lantern swaying from her hand as she walked the narrow gravel path that skirted the western wing. The gardens lay dark and quiet, but the silence felt strange tonight, almost listening. She tucked a strand of hair beneath her plain cap and quickened her pace, eager to reach the servants' quarter before the night deepened, when suddenly a firm stride echoed ahead, measured, deliberate, unmistakably aristocratic. She froze, heart tightening, because servants did not cross paths with nobility at this hour unless fate was feeling unkind. But when the figure emerged from the bend in the path, lantern light spilling across his features, Maren's breath vanished entirely. Duke Dorian Blackwater stopped mid-step, his cloak brushing the gravel, the faint salt wind outlining the sharp lines of his face. His eyes, cool and unreadable to most, met hers directly, without drifting past her the way every other gaze had her whole life. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The silence pulsed like the beat of distant waves as the lantern light flickered between them, illuminating her startled expression and the sudden, unmistakable crease in his own composed features, a flicker of recognition where none should have existed. Maren felt the world narrow to the small circle of gold surrounding them, the rest of the night falling away until only the impossible truth remained. He was looking at her, truly looking, as though he had been waiting to find her on this path without ever knowing it. Her fingers tightened around the wooden handle of the lantern, the warmth of the metal seeping into her palm as her thoughts tangled between fear and something far more fragile. She should curtsy, she should apologize, she should disappear. But she could not move, and Dorian, the man known for restraint carved from stone, did something he had never done for a servant. He inclined his head. The gesture was slight, the impact was shattering, and Maren understood, with a trembling certainty, that nothing in her life would ever return to its quiet, unseen shape again. Dorian Blackwater told himself repeatedly that the strange moment beneath the lantern's glow had been nothing more than fatigue, the residual tension of a long day spent surveying storm damage along Ravonsmere's jagged cliffs. Yet the lie frayed each time he replayed the servant girl's startled eyes in his mind, refusing to dissolve into insignificance as every other servant's face had done for years. He returned to his chambers unsettled, pacing before the tall windows as moonlight streaked across the polished floorboards, trying to convince himself that he had imagined the flicker of recognition, the shift inside him that felt dangerously close to awakening something he had buried in the aftermath of loss. He was a man who prided himself on order, on self-command so strict it bordered on armor, and yet the simple memory of a young woman holding a lantern, her breath catching, her gaze unflinching despite her fear, had undone him with humiliating ease. He shrugged off the feeling, telling himself the estate demanded his attention, and his thoughts had no business lingering on a servant whose name he didn't even know. Still, when he closed his eyes, the moment returned like a tide he could not refuse. Across the manor, Maren moved through the morning with meticulous care, determined to bury the memory that haunted her far more deeply than she wished to admit. She swept the laundry corridor in precise strokes, folded linens with practiced efficiency, and kept her chin low whenever nobility passed, terrified that someone might have witnessed the moment the Duke paused before her, or worse, might suspect something unseemly. But nothing in the household had changed. No one spoke her name, no one glanced twice, and the invisibility she had worn her whole life settled back over her shoulders like a familiar cloak, except now it felt strangely suffocating, as though last night's lantern light had cast her into a world where being unseen no longer felt like safety, but a quiet kind of grief. She told herself the Duke surely had not remembered her after the moment passed. Men like him never remembered women like her. And yet, when she stepped into the East Hall with a tray of folded napkins, her heart lurched when she sensed rather than saw him turning the corner ahead. Dorian did not speak, neither did she. But his gaze, brief, searching, sharp with something he immediately hid, met hers before gliding away. It lasted a second, maybe less, but Maren felt the tremor of it all the way to her fingertips. She lowered her eyes quickly, hoping her breathless reaction had gone unnoticed, but the Duke walked on with a tension in his shoulders that suggested the moment had not been as trivial for him as he pretended. By the time he disappeared from sight, both understood, though neither dared admit it, that whatever had sparked beneath the lantern's glow was not finished with them. By midday, the corridors of Ravonsmere hummed with the soft rustle of servants moving in their practiced rhythms, yet beneath the ordinary bustle ran a current of hushed speculation that Maren could not escape, no matter how diligently she kept her eyes lowered. As she carried a stack of freshly laundered linens through the narrow passage behind the dining room, two maids lingered near the stairwell, their voices drifting in murmured threads about the Duke's demeanor and the lingering storm damage. But then, as Maren drew closer, their whispers sharpened almost imperceptibly, turning toward the subject of the Duke himself, how he had grown colder over the years, how some said his heart had shattered beyond mending after the drowning of his betrothed, how Lady Berenice Harroway had long been expected to step into the place once promised to another. Maren kept walking, feigning indifference, yet each word pricked like nettles against her skin, not because she held any claim to concern, but because hearing fragments of the Duke's sorrow made the memory of their brief encounter ache with a new and unsettling clarity. It seemed absurd to feel anything at all. She was a servant with no right to notice the grief of a man so far above her world. But the image of his eyes, cool and storm-grey, yet flickering with something vulnerable, replayed itself in her thoughts until she feared it might never loosen its hold. She rounded the corner toward the main hall, adjusting her grip on the linens, when the air shifted with unmistakable authority. Dorian Blackwater strode along the corridor, his steps steady, his expression guarded, speaking quietly with his steward about roof repairs. Maren immediately stepped aside, flattening herself against the wall the way she always did, but before she could lower her gaze completely, the Duke's eyes lifted toward her as though pulled by instinct. The moment stretched impossibly thin. His stride faltered by the smallest fraction, so slight anyone else might have missed it, yet enough for Maren's breath to catch on the edge of fear and something perilously close to hope. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement beyond the briefest flicker of recognition in his eyes, but that flicker was enough to unravel the fragile composure she had built since the night before. Dorian recovered quickly, returning his attention to the steward, though a tightening in his jaw betrayed an internal conflict he could not quite conceal. Maren watched him vanish into the adjoining hall, her pulse unsteady, her thoughts a tangle of guilt for noticing and longing for what noticing implied. When she resumed her tasks, the corridor felt smaller, the walls closer, as though the entire estate had begun conspiring to pull their paths together in ways neither of them understood. And though she tried to convince herself that nothing meaningful had occurred, the truth pressed insistently beneath her ribs. The Duke had seen her again, and the world had tilted once more. The storm arrived with a violence that seemed almost personal, hurling sheets of rain against Ravonsmere's ancient stone as though intent on testing the estate's very bones. By late evening, the wind had torn several shutters free and forced water through the weakened seams of the western roof, flooding parts of the upstairs corridor and leaving the household scrambling in frantic disarray. Maren, soaked through from running errands between wings, hurried wherever the steward pointed, her shoes squelching with every step as thunder rolled overhead in deep, shuddering waves. She thought she might be dismissed to the servants' hall once the servants reorganized their tasks, but instead the steward turned abruptly and gestured toward the tall double doors of the library, a place she had never once been assigned to in all her years at Ravonsmere. "You," he said briskly, "assist His Grace with relocating documents before the leaks worsen. Carefully, mind you." Maren blinked in confusion, unsure whether she had misheard, but there was no time to question orders. She grasped her lantern and stepped inside. The library, usually dim and serene, felt strangely alive under the storm's assault, lightning casting ghostlit flashes across tall shelves and scattered papers. And there, standing amid the chaos of open ledgers and half-rolled maps, was Dorian Blackwater. He glanced up at the sound of the door closing, his expression sharpening at the sight of her, surprise flickering quickly into something quieter, steadier, as though her presence made unexpected sense to him in this fractured moment. Maren's breath hitched, though she forced herself into a respectful posture, waiting for instruction. Dorian offered a brief nod, his voice low, and even despite the thunder cracking overhead. "The leak above the north shelves worsens by the minute. I require assistance relocating the older documents. Handle them gently, they date back centuries." She murmured a soft, "Yes, Your Grace," and moved to gather the nearest stack. At first they worked in near silence, the sound of rain swelling and receding in rhythmic waves, punctuated only by Dorian's occasional directions and Maren's soft confirmations. She kept her eyes on her task, yet she felt him, his presence, his attention, the steady force of him, like a tide pulling gently at her awareness. Each time she passed him with an armful of documents, she sensed the quiet shift in the air, as though their proximity unsettled something inside him as much as it did her. When thunder cracked so loudly that the shelves trembled, Maren startled, her fingers slipping on a set of rolled maps. Before she could recover, Dorian's hand reached out to steady them, and for the briefest moment, their hands nearly brushed. The space between them tightened, fragile and charged, illuminated by a flash of lightning bright enough to turn the entire room silver. Nothing was spoken. Nothing needed to be. In the middle of the storm, surrounded by the groaning timbers of the estate, the distance between Duke and servant felt more precarious than ever, as though the entire world had shifted them 1 inch closer than propriety allowed, and neither of them, trembling beneath the storm's relentless cadence, knew how to step back. By the time the storm began to settle into a steady, exhausted drizzle, the library had transformed into a maze of rescued ledgers and half-sorted maps strewn across tables in hurried stacks. Maren worked quietly, her sleeves damp, her pulse still unsteady from the earlier near touch, reminding herself with every breath that she was here only because necessity had placed her in the Duke's path, not because she belonged anywhere near him. Yet as she reached behind a lower shelf to gather a final bundle, her fingers brushed something brittle and unexpected. She tugged gently, revealing an aged parchment covered in delicate hand-drawn ink that shimmered faintly in the lantern light. It was a map, old, worn, and nearly forgotten. Cradling it carefully, she rose to bring it to the Duke, intending only to fulfill her task and withdraw. "Your Grace," she began, her voice soft. This was lodged behind the shelf. Dorian looked up from a water-spotted ledger, his gaze sharpening with interest as she unfolded the parchment between them. He stepped closer, studying the faded coastline sketched across its surface. "This predates most of the records we recovered," he murmured, fingertips hovering just above the ink. "Strange how the bay is drawn here, wider, almost distorted." Maren hesitated, feeling the weight of impropriety pressing against her tongue, but something in his tone, curiosity, openness, gave her courage to speak. "It may not be distortion, Your Grace," she said quietly. "The sea has been eating at the cliffs for decades. My father used to say the land falls away faster than folk notice. Perhaps the map is not inaccurate, only older than the shoreline is today." Her words slipped into the air like a truth she had no right to offer. She felt heat rise to her cheeks and immediately lowered her gaze, already regretting her boldness. But instead of reprimand, a moment of astonished silence followed, and when she dared to look up, she found Dorian studying her, not with annoyance, but with a quiet, dawning intrigue that unsettled her more than any reprimand could have. "You speak with certainty," he said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it, and with understanding most would not consider. Maren swallowed, unsure how to answer. "Only what I have observed, Your Grace, nothing more." But Dorian's expression did not shift back into its customary reserve. If anything, something within him seemed to ease, as though her words had pierced a layer of stillness he had not realized encased him. They stood like that for a moment, two figures framed by lantern glow and the lingering rumble of distant thunder, connected by an impossible, fragile thread. Then Maren stepped back, remembering herself, her station, her place in the world she had never been allowed to imagine beyond. She offered a timid curtsy and retreated before her trembling became too visible. When the door closed behind her, Dorian remained unmoving, his thoughts scattered by the echo of her quiet intelligence and the warmth in her voice. For the first time in years, something inside him stirred, not a storm, but the faint, undeniable beginning of change. The following morning dawned grey and heavy, the storm's remnants clinging to the sky like a sullen reminder of all that had shifted within Ravonsmere overnight. Maren kept to the lower corridors, scrubbing floors still damp from leaking windows, doing everything in her power to sink back into the invisibility she had worn for years. Yet her thoughts refused obedience, drifting again and again to the quiet warmth in the Duke's voice as he listened to her. The near wonder in his expression, as though he had glimpsed something unexpected in her that she herself had never dared to claim. She reminded herself sternly that such moments were accidents, born of necessity and the storm, nothing more. But even as she repeated the thought, A flutter of emotion stirred in her chest, fragile and treacherous. The illusion of stillness shattered by midday, when the echo of carriage wheels grinding through wet gravel rippled through the estate. Servants straightened at once, some in surprise, others in barely concealed dread, because there was only one person who arrived unannounced with the confidence of ownership: Lady Berenice Harroway. Maren felt the shift in the atmosphere before she saw anything, the kind of tightening that always preceded the entrance of someone who enjoyed watching others scramble. She kept her head low as the tall doors opened, and Lady Berenice swept inside, her gown shimmering with travel-dulled silk, her posture regal, her eyes sharp enough to slice through stone. She greeted the steward with a practiced smile that held no warmth, and let her gaze glide over the servants, assessing them with the ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Maren tried to slip behind a pillar, but Berenice's gaze passed over her briefly, dismissively, and the subtle sting of that dismissal surprised her more than it should have. Better to be unseen, she reminded herself. Unseen meant safe. Yet an uneasy knot formed in her stomach as Lady Berenice continued down the hall, her stride purposeful, clearly seeking the Duke. It was said she had long considered herself the natural, inevitable choice for Dorian's future, and the confidence in her step made the rumors feel painfully plausible. As Berenice approached the west corridor, Dorian himself appeared, composed and unreadable as ever, offering her a polite greeting. They exchanged formalities with the ease of long acquaintance, though his posture was straighter, more distant than one might expect. Still, Maren watched the scene with a prickling sensation she could not explain, an ache she had no right to feel. Lady Berenice leaned in slightly, speaking with fluid charm, but Dorian's responses remained cool, measured, almost perfunctory. Yet when he noticed Maren in the shadows behind the pillar, an accident, a flicker of attention quickly concealed, something subtle shifted in his expression. Maren ducked her head at once, heart pounding, but Berenice followed the moment with narrowed eyes. It lasted no more than a breath, but for Lady Berenice, a woman skilled in reading weakness, that single glance was enough to ignite suspicion, and suspicion, in the hands of someone like her, was as dangerous as a drawn blade. Maren moved through the servant corridors with deliberate care the following morning, her steps measured, her chin lowered, as though she could will herself back into the quiet obscurity that had defined her life before lantern light and storm-soaked libraries rearranged the very shape of her thoughts. But invisibility had become a fragile cloak, one that no longer settled over her as naturally as it once had. She could feel the subtle shift in the household, the way certain glances lingered an instant longer than before, the way whispered conversations paused when she entered a room. She knew these signs too well. They were the early tremors of danger. Even before anyone spoke, her instincts warned her that proximity to a man like the Duke, even in the smallest, most innocent measure, invited scrutiny she could not afford. And her instincts proved correct when two older maids cornered her near the laundry stairwell, their faces drawn with worry rather than malice. "Maren," one murmured in a voice barely above a whisper, "you must be cautious. His Grace has no reason to take notice of a girl like you. If he has, if anyone thinks he has, you will be the one to pay for it." The second nodded fervently, adding, "Lady Berenice is watching everything. She won't tolerate anyone drawing his attention, even by accident. Keep your head low, child, for your own sake." Their warnings tightened around Maren's chest like a cord, and though she thanked them with trembling gratitude, dread pooled in her stomach. She had never sought the Duke's attention. She had never sought anything except to survive each day without incident. But the memory of his eyes, steady, discerning, almost gentle, rose unbidden, complicating every attempt to return to the quiet life she had known. Still, she forced herself to shrink her presence, to step more softly, to avoid any corridor where she might encounter him. She kept her gaze fixed on her tasks, her thoughts disciplined, her breath shallow, terrified that a single misstep would bring ruin. Yet even as she tried to disappear, fate, or something perilously close to longing, worked against her. When she carried linens through the main hall that afternoon, Dorian Blackwater appeared at the far end, walking beside his steward, discussing repairs with his usual composed authority. Maren immediately turned toward a side passage, but before she could slip away, his gaze found her with unsettling precision, as though he sensed her presence long before he saw her. It was only an instant, a flicker of attention, but she felt its impact like a physical touch. His expression shifted, so subtly no one else would notice, yet unmistakably towards something softer. She looked away at once, her heart hammering in fierce rebellion, but the effort to steady herself nearly broke her. Dorian continued walking without a word, yet the tension in his posture betrayed something restless, something quietly unwilling to let her fade back into invisibility. And Maren, though she forced her steps forward, understood with a sinking certainty that whatever had begun between them had already grown beyond her control. A servant's place was clear, rigid, unyielding, but the Duke's gaze was beginning to unravel those boundaries stitch by fragile stitch. The storm had passed, but its remnants clung stubbornly to the sky, turning the morning a muted wash of grey as Dorian Blackwater crossed the great hall toward his study. He carried himself with the rigid composure that had become second nature, measured steps, shoulders squared, expression impenetrable, yet beneath the practiced calm lay a restlessness he could no longer ignore. He had slept poorly, haunted by thoughts he refused to name, thoughts that carried the shape of a servant girl with lantern light in her eyes. It was absurd, dangerous, even, to let such an encounter disturb him, and yet every attempt to restore order to his mind only tightened the knot of contradiction inside him. He had just reached his study when another voice, deep and familiar, cut through the quiet. "You look worse than the stormed roofs," Alistair remarked dryly from the doorway. Dorian halted. His elder brother stepped into the room with the ease of someone who belonged anywhere he wished, brushing rain from his coat as he fixed Dorian with an assessing stare. The two men stood in silence for a moment, brothers bound by blood, by shared grief, and by the painful divide that tragedy had carved between them. "If you have come to criticize the estate repairs," Dorian said evenly, "I assure you everything is well in hand." Alistair snorted softly. "I came because you have retreated even deeper into that fortress you call composure. I am beginning to wonder if the sea has carved you hollow." Dorian stiffened, but Alistair pressed on, his tone gentler now. "You were not always like this. There was a time when you felt things openly, when you believed in futures not dictated solely by duty." A shadow flickered across Dorian's features, pain, sharp and quickly concealed, as the memory of a woman with wind-tangled hair and bright laughter flashed behind his eyes. His fiancée, lost to the sea long ago. He said nothing, but the silence itself was confession enough. Alistair's expression softened further. "I know you grieved. I know it broke something in you, but you cannot let the past steal the rest of your life." Dorian turned away, jaw clenched, bracing himself against the ache that always followed any mention of loss. "I have responsibilities," he said tightly. "Duty leaves no room for indulgence." "Indulgence?" Alistair repeated, stepping closer. "Is that what you call it? Or is that what you fear?" Dorian's shoulders stiffened, but before he could respond, the image of Maren flickered unbidden across his mind, her quiet strength, her trembling courage, the way her voice had softened the storm's chaos. He pushed the thought away fiercely, yet it lingered, stubborn as the tide. Alistair watched him for a long moment, and then spoke with quiet certainty. "Something has stirred you. I see it. You can deny it, Dorian, but you are not as unreachable as you pretend." Dorian's breath caught, betraying him. He offered no response, but Alistair's knowing expression said he needed none. As the door closed behind his brother, Dorian stood alone in the dim light, the past pressing like a weight on his ribs, and the impossible truth rising within him that a servant girl's quiet presence had awakened a corner of his heart he thought forever sealed. The morning light had barely begun stretching across the stone floors when Lady Berenice Harroway initiated what she called an efficiency review, though every servant recognized it immediately for what it truly was, a performance of authority. She swept through the service wing in immaculate silks, wholly unsuited for the narrow corridors, her perfume thickening the air with each purposeful stride. Maren, carrying a bundle of folded napkins toward the dining room, kept her gaze lowered as the noblewoman approached, praying to remain unnoticed, but fate rarely extended such mercy to those who needed it most. Berenice's eyes landed on her with a sharp glint of recognition of nothing more than Maren's existence, yet that alone felt dangerous. Before Maren could slip past, Berenice's voice rang out, crisp and commanding. "You there, stop." Maren froze, her fingers tightening instinctively around the linen bundle. Berenice gestured toward a nearby side table where a silver tray rested slightly askew. "Explain why this item has been left out of place," she demanded, though her tone suggested the answer had already been decided. Maren's pulse quickened. She had not been assigned to this corridor earlier. She had not touched the tray. "My lady, I do not know," she replied softly, careful not to sound defensive. The two maids nearby exchanged nervous glances, but none dared speak. Berenice's lips curled, satisfaction gleaming beneath feigned disappointment. Negligence reflects poorly on the entire household. Order must be maintained. Perhaps you are overwhelmed by your duties. Humiliation crawled up Maren's spine, hot and suffocating. Before she could respond, the corridor's air shifted with the unmistakable presence of authority. Dorian Blackwater appeared at the far end, his expression unreadable as he approached. Maren wished desperately to disappear, but Berenice straightened with predatory grace, her voice turning honeyed and theatrical. "Your Grace," she said, gesturing delicately toward the tray, "it seems this servant has been careless. Such disorder cannot stand." Dorian's gaze flicked to Maren for a single heartbeat, long enough for her to see the faint tightening at the corner of his jaw, before he turned to the tray. "Where is the ledger for this item?" he asked. His tone was calm, almost cold. A footman scrambled forward with the record book, handing it over with trembling hands. Dorian opened it, scanning the entries with swift precision. "This tray was reassigned to the upper parlor 2 days ago," he said after a moment, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "It was returned by mistake this morning. The error is not hers." Berenice's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Maren to glimpse irritation beneath the lacquered politeness. "I see," she said tightly. "A misunderstanding, then." But Maren knew better. The remark had never been about the tray. Dorian closed the ledger gently, his voice steady but edged with unmistakable judgment. "Accuracy is essential. Let us ensure any concerns are grounded in fact." Berenice inclined her head with strained grace, but her eyes flicked toward Maren with a promise of quiet retaliation. As Dorian departed, Maren felt the burn of humiliation slowly giving way to something more fragile, relief tinged with fear, and beneath it all, the dangerous truth that the Duke had noticed her again, not by accident but by instinct. Dusk settled over Ravonsmere with the gentleness of a sigh, the bruised sky fading into muted rose as lanterns flickered to life across the western gardens. Maren moved quietly among them, lighting each wick with careful hands, grateful for the brief solitude that came with this small evening duty. The events of the day clung to her like damp fabric, the humiliation under Lady Berenice's gaze, the shock of being defended by the Duke, the whispered scrutiny that followed her through the corridors. Out here, beneath the soft sweep of twilight, she could finally breathe, though even the cool air could not fully loosen the knot of anxiety lodged beneath her ribs. She bent to light another lantern, watching the flame bloom and steady, wishing her heart would do the same. But the moment the thought formed, she felt the faint tremor in the air, the subtle shift that always seemed to accompany his presence before she even saw him. Dorian Blackwater stepped into the garden path, his silhouette framed by the final streaks of fading light. Maren's breath stuttered, her fingers tightening around the lantern pole as he drew closer with slow, measured strides. She had not expected him, not here, not now. She lowered her gaze at once, hoping to slip into the comfort of invisibility, but his voice, low, steady, impossibly gentle, broke the silence. "Maren." Hearing her name in his voice nearly unraveled her. She turned slightly, enough to acknowledge him but not enough to expose the turmoil on her face. "Your Grace," she managed, praying her voice did not betray its tremble. He studied her for a moment, the quiet length of his gaze warming the space between them more than the lantern flames ever could. "I came to ensure all was well," he said finally, though something deeper threaded through the words, something he did not dare articulate. Maren swallowed, shaking her head lightly. "There is no need, Your Grace. Today was only a misunderstanding." But the tremor in her voice cast doubt on her reassurance. Dorian stepped closer, not enough to breach propriety, yet close enough that the lantern light softened his expression into something almost humanly vulnerable. "It should not have happened," he said, each word deliberate. "You were placed in an unfair position." Her breath caught, and she turned her face away, ashamed of the sting in her eyes. "I do not wish to cause trouble," she whispered, "for anyone." Dorian hesitated, as though fighting words he longed to speak, but had no right to offer. "Trouble," he said quietly, "is not always caused by the one who suffers it." The garden seemed to still, the air thickening with unsaid truths neither dared name. Maren felt him watching her, felt the pull of something she knew she should resist, yet could not bring herself to flee. When Dorian finally inclined his head and stepped back, the absence of his nearness felt like a physical ache. He left without another word, disappearing into the twilight, leaving Maren beneath the lantern light with her heart trembling and painfully alive. By the next morning the estate hummed not with the usual rhythm of routine but with the unmistakable tension of whispered speculation, the kind that slithered through corridors and crept beneath doors, attaching itself to those least prepared to bear its weight. Maren felt it before she heard it, the way conversations thinned when she approached, the way glances flicked toward her with something sharper than simple curiosity. She carried a tray of folded linens past the servants' pantry when two footmen lowered their voices, their words sliding into the air like poisoned threads. It was no mistake, one muttered. The Duke doesn't interfere in such matters unless he cares. The other scoffed quietly. Care? For a servant? Don't be foolish. Yet even as he dismissed the idea, doubt softened the edges of his tone. Maren's pulse fluttered painfully. She quickened her steps, praying no one noted the way her hands trembled. In the scullery, the cook's assistant stole glances at her, eyes narrowing with suspicion wrapped in pity. Maren kept her focus on her work, but every clang of metal, every rustle of fabric felt sharper than it should. Rumors were as dangerous as fire, quick to spread, hungry for fuel, indifferent to the lives they consumed. She knew well that a servant caught in the orbit of a nobleman's attention rarely escaped unscathed, and still she could not shut out the memory of the Duke's voice in the garden, low and quiet beneath the lantern light, carrying a softness she had no right to remember. Meanwhile, Dorian Blackwater moved through the halls unaware of the quiet storm gathering in his wake, though irritation hummed beneath his composure every time he sensed the servants' lingering gazes. He did not understand the shift at first, but he felt it, an undercurrent in the household that tightened the air around him like a snare. When he noticed Maren in the corridor outside the linen room, her shoulders drawn inward, her steps smaller than usual, something sharp flickered inside him, an instinct to shield her, to peel back whatever weight pressed upon her. But propriety anchored him where he stood. He forced himself to remain silent, even as his gaze followed her with attention he barely concealed. By midday the rumors had grown bold enough to reach Lady Berenice's ears. She paused at the top of the staircase, lips curving into a smile that held no warmth as she observed the unease around her. It did not take long for her trained eye to notice the subtle shifts, the servant girl's discomfort, the Duke's inexplicable attentiveness, the whispers that swirled like smoke, and in that moment something cold and calculating stirred behind her elegant composure. Maren felt it too, a chill prickling along her spine as if the house itself were warning her. She knew then, with sinking certainty, that the fragile thread connecting her to the Duke had begun weaving a shadow she might not be able to outrun. By the time afternoon light slanted through the high windows of Ravonsmere, Maren had nearly convinced herself that if she simply moved quietly enough, breathed lightly enough, and avoided every possible misstep, the rumors might lose their sharpness and dissolve into the background hum of household gossip. Yet fate, or more precisely, the Duke's restless thoughts, seemed determined to unravel every attempt she made at invisibility. She had just finished stacking linens in the corridor outside the grand study, when the steward approached with an unusual expression, his brow furrowed not with displeasure but with confusion, as though he had been handed a task that made no sense even to him. "Maren Elwood," he said, his voice clipped but not unkind. "His Grace has requested your assistance in the study for the remainder of the afternoon. You are to help catalogue several historical documents." For a moment Maren could only stare at him, her breath thinning as the words settled. This was not done. Servants did not enter the Duke's study, except to deliver trays or fetch items under strict instruction, and they certainly were not assigned to work beside him for extended periods. "Sir, surely there are others better suited," she began, panic threading through her voice, but the steward shook his head briskly. His Grace was explicit. And with that, the matter was sealed. Maren stepped into the study with her heart pounding, the scent of old parchment and polished wood enveloping her like a memory she had not yet lived long enough to claim. Dorian Blackwater looked up from his desk, and something inside him eased at the sight of her, though he masked it quickly. "Thank you for assisting," he said in a tone that attempted formality, but carried an undertone far too gentle to be strictly professional. Maren bowed her head, her palms damp. "I will do whatever is required, Your Grace." He gestured to a table covered in rolled maps, brittle letters, and bound ledgers. These documents must be sorted by century. Some require transcription before they deteriorate further. His words were measured, but his gaze, oh, that gaze, kept flickering toward her with a quiet warmth he seemed powerless to restrain. Maren forced herself to focus, sorting the first stack with trembling precision. Yet each time their hands reached toward the same parchment, each time his voice dipped closer to hers in explanation, a charged silence wove itself between them, subtle yet unmistakable. Outside the study, footsteps slowed as servants passed, their curiosity rising like steam beneath the door. Maren felt the weight of every glance she could not see, felt the consequences gathering like a storm she had no shield against. She should not be here, working by his side as though she belonged in his world. And yet, when Dorian leaned slightly nearer, pointing to a faded crest on an aging manuscript, she felt the fragile, devastating truth blooming inside her. She wanted this moment, however dangerous, however fleeting. And Dorian, watching her with a tenderness he could not name, wanted it too. The days that followed unfolded with an almost unbearable quietness, each hour spent in the Duke's study deepening a thread of connection that neither Maren nor Dorian dared acknowledge aloud. What should have been a simple cataloguing task became, piece by piece, an unspoken exchange of glances, murmured observations, and a gentle shifting of breath whenever their hands strayed too close. Maren tried with all her strength to anchor her attention to the documents before her, tracing delicate inkwork and faded script with studious care, but her composure betrayed her each time she felt his gaze linger, curious, thoughtful, far warmer than propriety allowed. She told herself she must not read anything into it, that his manner came from habit or courtesy or the simple necessity of collaboration. Yet no matter how fervently she insisted upon this, her heart betrayed her each time he leaned over her shoulder, his voice low and steady as he explained a crest's origin or a noble family's history, his presence brushing against her senses like a whisper she could not unhear. For Dorian, the study had become treacherous terrain. He found himself anticipating her arrival each morning, listening for the soft footsteps approaching down the corridor, feeling a quiet bloom of something dangerously close to hope whenever she entered with her head bowed and her hands clasped nervously before her. He truly tried, to maintain a respectful distance, to treat her as any diligent assistant would be treated, but her gentle intelligence dismantled every defense he attempted to uphold. Her insights into the documents were not only accurate but unexpectedly perceptive, and he found himself drawn not only to her competence, but to the warm humility with which she offered each observation. Her presence steadied him in ways he could not explain, softening edges he had thought permanently carved into him by grief. He would glance at her when she wasn't looking, studying the delicate slope of her brow, the concentration in her eyes, the fragile determination in her posture, and each time he looked away too late, already aware that he had allowed himself to feel something he had sworn he could no longer feel. Outside the study walls, the mansion pulsed with speculation that grew louder each day. Servants passed with tense shoulders, their glances sharp, their whispers sharpening into certainty. Lady Berenice drifted through the halls with a watchful stillness that made the air feel colder, her attention narrowing with predatory precision whenever the Duke's study door opened, and Maren emerged with reddened cheeks and trembling fingers. Maren felt the scrutiny like a tightening wire around her heart. She knew she must distance herself, that every smile she attempted to hide, every breath of warmth she and the Duke shared, carved her a little deeper into danger. And yet, each time she resolved to step away, she arrived the next morning with her pulse already betraying her intent. Their restraint became its own kind of yearning, quiet, endless, aching, woven into the very air they breathed. And in those stolen fragments of closeness, neither dared to imagine how long their fragile balance could last. Lady Berenice Haraway had always possessed a keen instinct for shifts in power, the subtle rearrangements of attention that indicated whether she remained securely at the center of a man's regard. It was how she had maintained her influence at Ravonsmere for so long, by sensing even the faintest tremor of change before anyone else perceived it. And now, as she glided through the manor with her impeccable posture and unyielding smile, she felt that tremor like a splinter beneath her skin. The Duke was different, distracted, unreachable in ways he had never been before. She had expected his grief to shape him into a man easily steered by familiarity and expectation, but instead she found walls she could not breach and shadows where warmth should have been. Her frustration sharpened into suspicion the moment she noticed the servant's strange behavior, the abrupt silences, the shifting glances, the tension that lingered when someone stepped too near the Duke's study. She watched, at first with mild curiosity, and then with growing unease, until her gaze finally fell upon Maren Elwood, emerging from the study with ink-stained fingers and a strained composure that did not suit a girl of her station. At first Berenice dismissed the possibility as absurd. Dorian, interested in a servant. A notion fit for poorly penned novels, not for a Duke of Ravonsmere. But the more she observed, the more that absurdity took on the uncomfortable texture of plausibility. She noticed the way Maren kept her head low, while still carrying a tremor beneath her calm, the way the Duke's voice softened by imperceptible shades when he addressed someone behind closed doors, the way a shadow of tension crossed his face whenever Berenice mentioned matters of marriage or alliances. A servant's presence should have meant nothing. And yet, something in the air around them told her it meant entirely too much. Berenice approached her suspicions with the quiet, calculated precision of someone accustomed to winning battles long before they reached open conflict. She asked subtle questions of the staff, nothing obvious, nothing incriminating, but enough to extract fragments of information: that the servant girl had been assisting the Duke personally, that she had been present during the storm, that his study door remained closed for long stretches while she worked inside. Piece by piece, the outline of a threat took shape, and with it came a cold, simmering jealousy that burned beneath Berenice's graceful exterior. She had tolerated many obstacles over the years, but never one that threatened the future she believed she deserved. As Maren passed through the corridor carrying a tray of sorted parchments, Berenice paused at the top of the staircase, her gaze narrowing to a fine, dangerous point. She did not speak. She did not need to. The weight of her attention alone was enough to send a shiver down Maren's spine, though Maren could not have named the reason. She only felt, deep in her chest, a sense of being seen in a way far different from how the Duke had seen her. This gaze held no warmth, only calculation. And calculation, in Lady Berenice's hands, was more perilous than open rage. For all her efforts to remain unobtrusive, Maren found that the more she tried to shrink from the Duke's presence, the more her absence seemed to echo in the spaces where she had once stood. She began avoiding the study whenever possible, shifting tasks with quiet desperation, slipping into hallways at odd hours to ensure she would not cross his path. She told herself it was the only way to protect them both, the only way to smother the growing warmth that threatened to consume her. But each missed morning, each delayed arrival, only tightened the air between them, weaving a tension that stretched across the manor like a drawn bow. And it was that tension that finally pushed Dorian past the boundaries of patience he had built so carefully around himself. He found her near the far bookshelf one late afternoon, her hands busy with a stack of documents she pretended required urgent sorting. The moment he stepped into the room, she felt him, before she heard him, before she saw him, his presence settling over her like a shift in the weather. "Maren," he said, not sharply, but with a depth that caught her breath mid-motion. She kept her gaze fixed on the parchments. "Your Grace," she whispered, willing her voice to remain steady. "I apologize for the delays today. There were other tasks that required attention." Dorian stepped closer, each footfall quiet, yet unyielding. "Do not lie to me," he said softly, the gentleness in his tone somehow more piercing than anger. "You have avoided this room for 3 days." Maren closed her eyes, the truth pressing heavily against her ribs. "I know my place," she said at last, her voice fraying at the edges. "And it is not here. It is not by your side, not in your study, not—" Her words faltered, swallowed by emotion she could not contain. Dorian's breath deepened, as though steadying himself against the storm building inside him. "Your place," he murmured, "is where your work is valued, where your presence is noticed, where your thoughts are heard." She shook her head, stepping back as though retreat alone could save them. "Your Grace, please. I cannot be the subject of whispers. I cannot invite danger upon myself or upon you." Her admission broke something in him. He moved closer, not touching her, yet near enough that she felt the heat of him, the ache he tried so hard to conceal. "You think this is mere misstep?" he asked quietly. "Maren, I have tried to ignore what stirs between us. I have failed." His voice trembled, just slightly, enough to undo her resolve entirely. She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes fully for the first time in days, and the force of the emotion she found there struck her like a blow. But even as longing surged between them, fear twined with it, cold and unavoidable. "We cannot," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You are a duke. I am nothing." Dorian's expression darkened, not with anger, but with anguish. "Do not say that. Not to me." The silence that followed was thick with everything they could not name: desire, fear, inevitability, and though neither stepped forward, neither stepped back. The distance between them remained unbroken, but the truth had already been laid bare. Dorian Blackwater had always believed that discipline was the armor of a man who wished to survive the world's cruelties, and for years he had worn that armor so tightly that even grief could find no purchase. But after his confrontation with Maren in the study, that armor felt as though it were cracking, thin fractures spidering through steel that had once seemed unbreakable. He wandered the quiet corridors long after dusk, the echo of her trembling voice haunting him more persistently than any memory he had fought to suppress. Each step carried the same question, unspoken yet relentless. How had he allowed a servant, a young woman who had entered his life without intention or design, to stir feelings he had long ago sworn were beyond him? He paused by a tall window overlooking the restless sea, the moonlight fractured across the waves, and pressed his hand to the cold glass as though grounding himself against the storm inside him. He told himself he needed distance. He told himself he needed clarity, but the truth pulsed fiercely beneath the lies. He wanted her, not in a passing, fleeting curiosity, but in a way that unsettled the very foundations of his carefully ordered world. Even the thought of her leaving the study that day, her eyes clouded with fear, her voice frayed by self-preservation, stung him with a guilt that refused to ease. He replayed every word she had spoken, every tremor in her breath, and found himself drowning in the realization that she had been trying to protect him as much as herself, that she had seen the danger in their closeness long before he had admitted its existence. And though he admired her strength, it was that same strength that twisted painfully through him now, because he could not bear the thought of her believing, even for a moment, that she was nothing. Not when her quiet intelligence had revived conversations he had forgotten how to enjoy. Not when her presence softened the grief he had believed permanent. Not when her very existence had awakened parts of him that had been cold for years. He moved to his study, hoping the familiar orderliness of parchment and ink would steady him, but instead the room felt hollow without her. The chair she had used remained slightly pulled out from the table, a faint reminder of where she had stood, tense, brave, vulnerable. As she confessed her fears, he sank into his own chair, elbows braced against the desk, and let his head fall into his hands. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full force of his turmoil, desire tangled with restraint, longing sharpened by the boundaries of class, anguish carved by the impossibility of the future he now saw too clearly. He knew he could not continue like this. He knew something had to break, and that breaking would change everything. And as he lifted his head, breath unsteady, he accepted the truth that had been pursuing him mercilessly. He was already far too deep to turn back. The morning broke with a thin, pale light that crept hesitantly across the servants' hall, as though even the sun sensed the tension settling over Ravonsmere. Maren had risen early, determined to lose herself in work before her thoughts betrayed her again, but fate, indifferent to her resolve, had other plans. A messenger arrived shortly after dawn, a small envelope in hand, worn at the corners and marked with the faint scent of wood smoke. He asked for her by name. Maren's heart stuttered. Letters rarely came for servants, and when they did, they seldom carried good news. She accepted it with trembling fingers and retreated to a quiet alcove near the back staircase, bracing herself before breaking the seal. The moment she opened it, the world seemed to contract to the width of the parchment. Her aunt, her only remaining family, the woman who had raised her after illness stole her parents, had fallen grievously ill. The village doctor feared she might not last the month. Maren's breath shuddered, the words swimming as she blinked rapidly, fighting the rising sting in her eyes. She read the letter once, twice, a third time, each repetition only tightening the ache inside her chest. The estate dissolved around her, until there was nothing but the memory of her aunt's gentle hands, the soft lullabies hummed at night, the sacrifices made so Maren might live. Panic fluttered beneath her ribs, sharp and disorienting. She knew her aunt needed her, now, not later. But the journey to her remote village required coin she did not possess, and time the household could not easily spare. Even if she begged permission to leave, she had no means to travel. And worse still, though she despised the weakness of the thought, she hesitated not only out of fear but out of the quiet, devastating pull that tied her to Ravonsmere, to the Duke whose presence had become both solace and torment. The memory of his anguished expression in the study, his voice trembling with restraint, rose unbidden, unraveling her already fraying composure. She pressed the letter to her chest, blinking hard as grief and longing intertwined in a way she had never imagined possible. Footsteps echoed distantly in the hall, the day beginning around her, oblivious to the fracture inside her world. She folded the letter with care, aware that every moment she delayed stole time from the woman who had once been her whole life. Yet the thought of approaching the steward, of requesting leave she could not afford, of risking dismissal for asking too much, it all felt like stepping into a second storm, one as unpredictable as the emotions clawing at her heart. Maren straightened slowly, her breath unsteady but her resolve forming through the ache. She had known sorrow before, she could bear it again. But the realization that she might soon have to leave Ravonsmere, that she might have to turn her back on the impossible, fragile bond growing between herself and the Duke, nearly brought her to her knees. Still, she whispered to herself, family first, even if it meant tearing herself away from the man who had finally seen her. Maren spent the rest of the morning moving through her tasks like a ghost drifting through familiar corridors, her body performing motions her mind could no longer hold together. Each folded linen and polished surface felt increasingly meaningless beside the urgent weight of the letter tucked safely against her apron. She had rehearsed the request a dozen times. May I take leave to visit my aunt? I understand if it cannot be granted, but the words shriveled each time she tried to imagine speaking them aloud. Permission was not guaranteed. Wages were insufficient for travel, and the rumors already tightening around her made her position tenuous enough without further complication. Still, with every passing moment, the thought of her aunt lying alone in their distant village gnawed at her until she could scarcely breathe. By the time she finally forced herself toward the steward's office, her palms were slick and her vision blurred around the edges. She never reached the door. As she passed through a narrower corridor near the western wing, the quiet shuffle of another servant's footsteps triggered a hushed exchange. Maren's name, the words distant kin, and gravely ill whispered with sympathetic uncertainty. She stiffened. Her letter must have been glimpsed, or her trembling noticed. Before she could retreat, another presence entered the hall, larger, steadier, unmistakably commanding. Dorian Blackwater approached from the opposite end, his expression unreadable in the morning light. Maren's breath caught, her instinct urging her to drop into a curtsy and flee, but her body refused to obey. He paused before her, gaze sweeping over her face with a quiet intensity that made her knees weaken. "You are troubled," he said softly, not as an accusation but as an undeniable truth. Maren lowered her gaze, clutching the letter so tightly the edges creased beneath her fingers. "It is nothing that concerns your grace," she whispered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Dorian's jaw tightened, an echo of frustration crossing his features, not at her, but at whatever burden she tried to shoulder alone. "Maren," he said again, gently but firmly, and at the sound of her name in that tone, something inside her broke. She inhaled sharply, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, as she offered him the folded letter, unable to speak further. He accepted it, reading swiftly yet carefully, and when his gaze lifted again, the storm within him was palpable. "You must go to her," he said without hesitation. At once, Maren blinked, startled. "Your Grace, I have no means. And the estate, I will arrange transportation," he interrupted quietly, "and whatever you require." A flush of panic rose in her. "I cannot accept charity. It would put you at risk. It would put me—" "Maren," he murmured, his voice a low ache. "This is not charity. This is what one does when someone matters." The words hung between them like a fragile, dangerous miracle. Maren felt her breath shudder, felt the ground shift beneath her feet, but fear, fierce, protective fear, forced her to step back. "I cannot," she whispered. "Please do not ask this of me." And though he said nothing more, the anguish in Dorian's eyes revealed the truth neither dared speak aloud. Refusing him hurt her far more than accepting ever could. The following days passed in a haze of hurried activity and forced composure, each moment spent in Ravonsmere's shadowed halls more suffocating than the last. Maren tried to focus on the mundane tasks assigned to her, but her thoughts, heavy with the implications of Dorian's offer, wandered uncontrollably. She had always believed that distance would keep her safe, that the walls of the estate would protect her from the things she could never have. But the space between her and Dorian had shrunk in ways she couldn't have imagined. Even now, with the weight of her aunt's illness hanging over her, it was the pull toward him that left her trembling with uncertainty. And then, the first whisper came. It was in the scullery, carried by a maid whose voice trembled just enough to convey the news with painful clarity. Lady Berenice Harroway had been watching Maren. Not just observing, but calculating. The Duke's recent defense of Maren had sent ripples through the household, ripples Berenice could not ignore. Maren had felt her cold gaze before, But the realization that Berenice had now set her sights on her with something far more dangerous than disdain sent a shiver of dread through her. Lady Berenice had never been one to tolerate rivals, and in her eyes, Maren was nothing more than an obstacle to the future she had carefully planned. It was only a matter of time before the trap was set. Maren first noticed the subtle changes when she arrived in the great hall one afternoon. She had just passed the kitchens when she was called into the side passage by one of the footmen. He handed her a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper. "For you, miss," he said, his tone slightly off, as though unsure whether he was doing something he ought not to. Maren's heart skipped in her chest. She opened the parcel carefully to reveal a delicate silver brooch, exquisite in its craftsmanship, an item unmistakably valuable. The name engraved on the underside was one she recognized, Lady Berenice Harroway. Her breath faltered. The brooch was a gift from the lady herself. She glanced nervously around her, feeling the walls close in, but it was when she returned the next day, as the estate prepared for the evening's gathering, that the trap sprung. Lady Berenice had cornered her in the garden, her eyes calculating and sharp. "Maren," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I trust you found my small gift to be to your liking." Maren, struggling to maintain her composure, managed a polite nod. "It is beautiful, my lady. Thank you." "But you see," Berenice continued, stepping closer, her tone shifting to one of cold precision, "I cannot help but notice that the servants seem to think highly of you. That's a rather dangerous thing, isn't it? People of your station have no need to be noticed by the Duke, or anyone else for that matter." Maren's breath caught, but before she could respond, Berenice's next words sent an icy chill through her. "There are those who would say that something of value should never be misplaced, especially not in a servant's hands." Berenice turned on her heel and walked away, her final words hanging in the air like a threat. "I shall see to it that your innocence is preserved, my dear, for now." Maren stood frozen in place, the weight of the brooch in her pocket feeling heavier than the world itself. The trap had been laid, and now, no matter what she did, there would be no escape. The atmosphere at Ravonsmere shifted that evening, the air thick with the unspoken weight of impending judgment. Maren's nerves were frayed beyond recognition as she prepared for the evening's meal service, her hands trembling so violently that she could scarcely hold the silver trays steady. The brooch, now tucked in the pocket of her apron, felt like an anchor pulling her down, threatening to drag her under with every passing second. She had tried to stay distant, to pretend nothing had changed, but each whisper, each calculating glance from Lady Berenice, left her more certain that the trap had already been sprung, and she, unwittingly, had walked right into it. The servants' hall was unusually quiet when the bell rang for dinner. Maren hurried to the serving table, trying to ignore the growing knot in her chest, but it was when the first of the guests began to filter in that she felt it, the unmistakable sense that something was wrong. The Duke, his features unreadable, entered with Lady Berenice by his side, her smile as practiced and cold as ever. Maren barely had time to turn before she felt the weight of Berenice's gaze fixed upon her, sharp and unforgiving. The hair at the back of her neck stood on end as the noblewoman's eyes flicked from her hands to her face, then down to her apron, where the faintest bulge suggested the brooch nestled in her pocket. Berenice's lips curled into a thin smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "It seems," she said with casual malice, "that a certain servant has been receiving gifts of rather extraordinary value. A silver brooch, perhaps?" She paused, waiting for the room to fall silent, and when it did, she turned her gaze to Maren, who was suddenly very aware of every eye in the room. "How curious, don't you think, that a servant of such low station would be in possession of something so valuable?" Maren's throat closed, the heat of humiliation flooding her chest, but she dared not speak. She couldn't. She knew better than to defend herself when the truth was already twisted beyond recognition. Berenice's accusations hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and when Dorian's eyes locked with hers, she saw nothing but cold disbelief, his gaze so sharp and accusing that it felt like a betrayal. I don't know how it got there," Maren whispered, but the words sounded weak even to her own ears. Before she could continue, Lady Berenice spoke again, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. "I'm certain the Duke will want to investigate how a servant could come into possession of something so precious." She turned to Dorian, her expression veiled in calculated concern. "Surely we cannot allow such matters to go unchecked." Dorian stood frozen for a moment, his jaw tight, his features set in a mask of impassive resolve. and for the first time, Maren saw how completely he had become part of a world that would never allow her to belong to it. She had thought, foolishly, that his gaze had softened toward her, that he had seen something in her worth protecting, but now, standing before him, she realized the extent of her own mistake. To him, she was just a servant, an object to be protected only as long as it served the interests of his world. "Take her to the kitchens," he ordered coldly, the words falling like stones between them. Maren's heart shattered. She turned and fled, unable to bear another second of the scene, knowing with a clarity born of the deepest dread that she had been marked. The accusations had been made, and there would be no escape from them now. Maren fled through the hallways with her heart pounding, her steps frantic, barely conscious of the murmurs trailing behind her. The walls of Ravonsmere, so familiar and so cold, pressed in on her, and with each footfall, her chest tightened, as though the weight of the estate itself was closing in. She hardly noticed where she was going until she found herself outside, the cool night air biting at her skin, the sky overhead a smothering blanket of black. She had no destination in mind, only the desperate need to escape, to breathe, to try to find something, anything, that could erase the suffocating horror that had taken root in her heart. The night stretched around her like a shroud, the only sound the faint whistle of wind through the trees and the rhythmic pulse of her own blood, so loud in her ears it drowned out the rest of the world. She walked, no, she stumbled, toward the garden, her mind a fog of confusion and betrayal. How had it come to this? One moment, she had been caught between hope and fear, and the next, her world had crumbled to dust beneath her feet. Dorian's cold dismissal, the weight of his unspoken disbelief, pressed like an iron band across her chest. She had expected anger, perhaps even confusion, but not this brutal emptiness that seemed to swallow every shred of tenderness she had once thought she'd seen in him. She reached the edge of the garden, where the faint glow of lanterns had always seemed like a promise of something more. But tonight, they seemed to mock her, flickering in the dark like distant stars, unreachable, out of her grasp. The path where Dorian had first noticed her, the one where their eyes had met across the lantern light, now felt like a lifetime ago. She had not wanted to believe the whispers, had not wanted to acknowledge the truth that had been staring her in the face all along. She was nothing. Nothing but a servant, nothing but a shadow in a house full of light. And yet, here she stood, beneath the same lanterns that had once held the possibility of something more. Here she stood, alone and abandoned, with the weight of her own worthlessness pressing against her like a suffocating tide. The sound of footsteps broke her from her thoughts, and she whirled around to find Dorian standing at the garden entrance, his figure framed by the soft, flickering light. He did not speak at first, only watched her with an unreadable expression, his face strained with a mixture of frustration and something she could not name. She wanted to turn away, to flee, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot, her body frozen in a blend of fear and longing. "You should not be out here," he said finally, his voice softer than it had been in the hall, yet still carrying the weight of something unsaid between them. Maren swallowed, her throat dry. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Then why do you run?" he asked quietly. The question hung between them, unanswered, but it was the unspoken weight of it that tethered her there. For the first time, she didn't run, she didn't turn away. And for a fleeting moment, the distance between them seemed smaller, the possibility of something more than a shadow flickering in the distance. But the moment passed. Dorian's face hardened again, the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself returning in full force. He looked away, and the warmth that had briefly illuminated his expression died like the fading glow of the lanterns overhead. "Go back inside," he ordered softly, before turning and walking away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet, carrying with them the finality of everything she could never have. The days that followed were a blur, each one folding into the next, with the kind of oppressive silence that could only exist in a house where unspoken truths weighed on every wall, and each step was measured with the sharp sting of consequence. Maren threw herself into her duties, pretending to forget the pain that lingered beneath every glance, beneath every word she exchanged with the staff, each more strained than the last. Yet the harder she tried to bury herself in her work, the more she felt the cold gaze of Lady Berenice tightening around her. The woman's suspicion was palpable, the gleam in her eyes cutting sharper with each passing day. Maren could feel it, the quiet, insidious way Berenice watched her, as if she were searching for a weakness to exploit, a crack in her armor through which to pour doubt and suspicion. It was in the early hours of one damp morning that Dorian finally took action. The truth of Berenice's intentions was clearer than ever, and he knew, as he paced the grand study in the cold light of dawn, that he could not ignore the growing threat any longer. His investigation began as a quiet affair, a mere suggestion of suspicion at first, but quickly his gut told him something far darker was unfolding beneath the surface. He had known Lady Berenice for years, had seen the ice in her manner, the calculating ambition that shaped every decision she made. What surprised him now was how much of that he had missed, how much of the poisonous web she had woven around him while he had been blind to it. Dorian's mind kept returning to the night he had seen Maren outside the study, her face filled with fear, her eyes too wide with the knowledge that her place in his world was a dangerous thing to claim. He had offered her help, yes, but his own guilt gnawed at him. He had not yet realized the true weight of his own feelings for her. The thought of losing her now, to the very people who would crush her for existing in his orbit, struck him with an intensity he had not expected. He had promised to protect her, but what protection had he truly offered? What had he done to stop the whispers that followed her, the isolation that surrounded her? Nothing. Nothing but standing idly by, watching it all unfold. As he began speaking to his staff under the guise of mundane inquiries, the cracks began to appear, small but telling inconsistencies in the stories. He traced the missteps to Lady Berenice's actions, her sudden, quiet accusations of Maren's supposed faults, the way she had planted the suggestion of dishonor where none had existed. The brooch, the whispers of Maren's supposed theft, had all been part of a trap, one designed to ruin the girl, to isolate her and push her beyond Dorian's reach. His frustration mounted, but so did the resolve that built in his chest, heavy and determined. He had been a fool, letting someone so toxic twist the narrative around a woman who had done nothing but exist with grace. He could not remain passive any longer. He would expose the truth, and when he did, he would do more than protect Maren from the cruelty of a woman who would stop at nothing to take his place. He would stand beside her, against every system, every expectation, and every ounce of fear that still held her back. For the first time in years, Dorian felt the stirrings of real action, of a decision that would irrevocably change everything. The weight of the days pressed relentlessly on Maren, suffocating her in a way she could not escape. Even as she went through the motions of her tasks, arranging silverware, delivering trays, folding linen, her mind was never truly free, always circling back to the one thing she could not outrun: the truth. The truth of Lady Berenice's accusations, the truth of the growing distance between her and the Duke, the truth of her own powerlessness in a world where she did not belong. Every glance she received, every whisper she overheard, felt like a tightening noose, each moment dragging her deeper into a pit of despair she could not claw her way out of. Maren found herself standing in the kitchen one evening, her hands moving automatically as she worked alongside the other servants. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, the clatter of pots and pans blending with the murmur of conversation. She barely heard it when the cook spoke to her, the words lost in the dull roar of her thoughts, but when the cook repeated herself, Maren turned, forcing a smile onto her face as she acknowledged the request. She knew the others had noticed, everyone had noticed, the way she had been avoiding the Duke, the way she had withdrawn from his presence, as though each moment spent near him was a danger she could no longer afford. But it wasn't just the rumors. It wasn't just Berenice. It was the way Dorian's eyes had shifted when he'd looked at her after the accusation, the way he had distanced himself, coldly and without explanation. She knew the truth of that, too. Maren's hands stilled, the weight of the brooch in her pocket a constant reminder of her place in the world. She had tried to deny it, to push it away, but the reality of her situation was inescapable. No matter how she felt, no matter how much she longed for something more, she was nothing but a servant. And servants did not belong with men like Dorian Blackwater. She had seen it in his eyes, that flicker of restraint that said everything without saying a word. He had done what he could to protect her, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Her thoughts spiraled, and as the evening wore on, they began to feel like chains, each one tightening with every passing hour. She could feel the suffocating weight of it all, the way her chest grew tighter with every breath, as though the walls of Ravonsmere were closing in on her. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. There was no place for weakness in her world. She could not afford to break. Not now, not when everything hung in the balance. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and when she looked up, she found herself face to face with Dorian. He stood at the door, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the space between them. She froze, her heart racing as their eyes locked. For a moment, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them suspended in a silence that was both heavy and fragile. "Maren," he said, his voice low but steady, "we need to talk." And in that moment, she knew everything she had been running from had finally caught up to her. Maren stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat as Dorian approached, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, the weight of his presence filling the space between them. She had known this moment would come, but she had not expected it to feel so unbearably real. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that things might resolve themselves, that somehow she could slip back into the shadows and let the storm pass without having to confront the truth she had been running from. But there was no more running now, no more pretending. The brooch, the whispers, the glances, they had all led to this moment, and now she was here, caught in the tangled web of her own fears and desires. Dorian's gaze softened as he stood before her, and for the first time in days, she saw something other than the cold detachment she had come to fear in him. His eyes, once distant and unreadable, now carried an emotion she could not name, a mixture of determination and something far more vulnerable. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, yet filled with a gravity that made her heart skip. "Maren," he said softly, "I've been investigating what happened. I know the truth now. The brooch, it was planted. It was never yours." Her heart hammered in her chest, the truth of his words cutting through the haze of doubt and fear that had clouded her thoughts for so long. She had suspected, of course, that the accusations had been fabricated, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing him acknowledge the injustice, sent a rush of conflicting emotions through her. Relief warred with shame, fear with something that almost felt like hope. "Lady Berenice," Dorian continued, his jaw tightening as he spoke her name, "she set you up. I didn't want to believe it, but now I know. She's been manipulating things behind the scenes, trying to paint you as something you're not." His eyes met hers then, the full weight of his gaze grounding her, forcing her to confront the reality of what had been happening around her. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected you better." Maren's breath caught, the sting of tears threatening to overwhelm her, but she held them back, unwilling to show the depth of the pain that had settled in her chest. "You don't need to protect me, Your Grace," she whispered, the words leaving her lips before she could stop them. "I'm just a servant. I don't belong here." Dorian took a step closer, the distance between them shrinking with each heartbeat. "No," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "You do belong here. You belong with me." The weight of his words struck her like a blow, and for a moment, Maren could hardly breathe. The Duke, Dorian Blackwater, was telling her with absolute certainty, that she belonged at his side. She wanted to believe him, to throw caution to the wind and allow herself to hope. But fear, as always, held her back, the fear that this could not possibly be real, that the divide between them was simply too vast. "I'll make this right," Dorian said, his voice low, determined. "Lady Berenice will be exposed for what she is, and I'll make sure you are free from this." Maren shook her head, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and self-doubt. "And what about the rumors? What about—" "Forget the rumors," Dorian interrupted, his voice rising just enough to make her look up at him. "Forget what they say, what they think. You are not defined by their lies, Maren. You are defined by who you are. And I won't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The silence that followed was thick, charged with unspoken promises and the weight of their shared emotions. Maren wanted to believe him, desperately. But even as his words wrapped around her heart like a lifeline, a part of her remained convinced that this impossible dream could never be her reality. The days following Dorian's declaration unfolded with a quiet intensity, as though the air itself had shifted, becoming thicker with the weight of what was yet to come. Maren had hoped, prayed, that everything would somehow return to its place, that the rumors would dissipate like smoke in the wind, and that Lady Berenice's machinations would fall apart as easily as they had been woven. But she knew better. Even with Dorian's promise to set things right, she could feel the storm brewing, the forces that would never let her go unnoticed again. And yet, as she moved through the halls of Ravonsmere, her heart pulsed with an unfamiliar and dangerous hope, the kind she had buried deep within her for years. The confrontation with Lady Berenice came swiftly, as inevitable as a thunderclap on a storm-ridden evening. Dorian had acted quickly, his quiet investigation exposing the web of lies the lady had carefully spun around Maren. He had gathered the necessary evidence, letters, witnesses, even Berenice's own admissions, And when the time came, he confronted her in the presence of the household, with Maren standing beside him, her hands trembling but her spine straight. Lady Berenice had, as expected, tried to maintain her composure, her gaze cold and calculating as she attempted to manipulate the situation. But Dorian was resolute, his words unyielding, as he exposed the extent of her deceit. The room had gone still, the weight of the truth falling over everyone present, and Maren felt her heart beat a little faster as Berenice's mask cracked. The lies she had told, the false accusations she had planted, all of it unraveled in front of the assembled guests, the servants, and the family. There was no escape for her now. For the first time, Maren could breathe freely, unburdened by the shame that had clung to her since that fateful day when the brooch had been planted in her belongings. She had been vindicated, not just in Dorian's eyes, but in the eyes of everyone who had doubted her. The weight of it was almost too much to bear, the release from the suffocating grip of Berenice's cruelty a shock to her system. As Berenice was escorted from the estate in disgrace, Maren found herself standing at Dorian's side, her heart racing not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of relief. The walls that had once seemed insurmountable, those walls built by class, by reputation, by duty, now seemed porous, as though they could be torn down one brick at a time. And Dorian, the man who had once seemed so unreachable, stood before her, his presence steady, his eyes soft with a tenderness she had never imagined could exist between them. "Maren," he said quietly, his voice low and filled with something that made her heart leap in her chest. "You are free, and I will never let anyone make you feel small again." Her breath caught, and for the first time since she had come to Ravonsmere, Maren allowed herself to truly believe in the possibility of something more. The future, once so uncertain, now stretched before her like an open road, waiting for her to walk beside the man who had not only seen her, but who had chosen to stand by her, no matter the cost. And as they stood there, together, with the weight of the past finally lifted, Maren knew this was only the beginning of a journey they would walk side by side. The days following Lady Berenice's disgrace unfolded with a quiet tension, the estate settling back into a rhythm that seemed normal at first glance, though it was anything but. Dorian and Maren moved through their days as though they had returned to the roles they had always played. He, the Duke, she, the servant, but there was an undeniable change in the air, a weight between them that neither could ignore. It wasn't in the way they spoke or the tasks they performed, but in the silences that now stretched between their words, in the unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted, something had begun to grow between them, something both beautiful and terrifying in its fragility. It was in the garden one evening, as dusk began to drape its soft mantle over the estate, that the tension between them reached its breaking point. Maren had been walking the familiar paths, her thoughts tangled in the events of the past few days, when she saw him. Dorian stood by the fountain, his back to her, his posture more rigid than usual, as though he too was struggling to find his place in the world that had suddenly been rewritten around them. He hadn't noticed her approach, and for a moment, Maren simply watched him, the quiet of the evening surrounding them both, the faint rustling of leaves in the trees the only sound. He had been so far away for so long, so locked in his world of duty and expectation, that even now, in the wake of everything they had both endured, it felt impossible to cross the final distance between them. And yet, she could not ignore the pull, the yearning that tugged at her heart whenever he was near. She had told herself to be patient, to wait for things to fall into place, but the truth was that there was no more waiting. Maren took a hesitant step forward, her breath catching in her throat as Dorian turned, his eyes locking with hers the moment he heard her approach. The world seemed to still around them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maren could see it in his eyes, the same longing, the same quiet desperation she felt herself. And then, without a word, he took a step closer, his hand reaching out, as though drawn by some invisible force. "Maren," he said her name like a prayer, a plea, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I can't." But before he could finish, she stepped forward, closing the space between them, her heart racing in her chest. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, she lifted her face to his, her lips trembling with the desire she had spent so long hiding. When their lips met, it was like the world fell away. The weight of the past, the expectations, the fears, it all disappeared in that moment, leaving only the two of them, standing together in the soft glow of the garden lanterns. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, as though they were both afraid it would break them, but then it deepened, the warmth of it sparking a fire neither could deny. Dorian's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, and Maren responded instinctively, her hands finding their place against his chest, her body pressing against his as though she had finally found the place she was meant to be. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, they stood there for a moment, staring at each other with wide eyes, as if they had both just discovered something they had longed for, but never dared hope could be theirs. And in that silence, in the stillness of the evening, they both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days after their first kiss passed in a strange, dizzying haze, the estate around them continuing as though nothing had shifted, yet both Maren and Dorian felt it, a palpable change in the air, a tremor of possibility that neither of them could ignore. They moved through their routines, exchanged glances and words, but there was a quiet space between them now, a distance neither of them knew how to cross. Every conversation felt fraught with unspoken truths, each word a delicate balance between the world they knew and the one they dared to imagine. For Dorian, the weight of his feelings for Maren had settled deep within him, something undeniable, something that defied every expectation of his title and station. He had always known that love was a luxury reserved for those with the freedom to choose, but here, now, he found himself caught between the man he was and the man he longed to be. He had stood beside her in moments of turmoil, defended her when others sought to tear her down, but that same protective instinct had begun to twist into something more dangerous, something that threatened to consume him. One evening, as the golden light of the setting sun poured into the study where he sat sorting through letters, Dorian found himself staring at the empty chair across from him, the place where Maren had sat only days before. The memory of her smile, her quiet grace, haunted him. His hands tightened around the papers before him, the weight of his duty pressing against him with the force of a storm. She was everything he had ever wanted, everything he had told himself he could never have. He could not offer her the future she deserved, not as things were, not as he was. He pushed the thought aside with frustration, but it lingered like a ghost. Every inch of him wanted to reach out, to pull her closer, to tell her what he had never said aloud. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He was a duke, bound by the chains of duty and propriety, and she was a servant, a woman whose worth was measured in silence and servitude. The weight of the world between them felt insurmountable. He knew it, she knew it, yet the ache in his chest did not dissipate, no matter how hard he tried to shove it into the corners of his mind. Maren, for her part, had not been able to erase the memory of that kiss either. She had never imagined a world where she could feel so much, so openly, so completely. It was as if every corner of her heart had been ignited in that brief moment, but reality had swiftly followed, as it always did. She was a servant. She belonged in the shadows, in the corners, never in the light of his world. She had tried to convince herself that the kiss had been an accident, a fleeting moment of weakness on both their parts. But as the days stretched on, she found herself questioning everything. Was she simply a fleeting distraction for him, a forbidden indulgence he could not resist for a moment, before retreating back to his world of duty and status? The fear of what they could never have twisted inside her, a knot that tightened with every passing day, and still, she could not stay away. As the weeks passed, the tension in Ravonsmere grew, not from within the walls of the estate itself, but from the outside world, an unseen force that had begun to press down on Dorian and the household with mounting pressure. It came in the form of letters, formal invitations, and visits from influential figures whose presence in the manor was never casual. The court was always watching, always waiting for a misstep, a hint of scandal that could be used against him, and Dorian could feel the weight of it like a noose around his neck. The letters that arrived daily now contained veiled suggestions, political maneuvering, and marriage proposals that were far more about alliances than love. Each one was an attempt to steer him away from the path he had been silently treading, toward a future that was undeniably his, yet felt increasingly out of reach. The whispers in the court were louder now. They had caught wind of the rumors about him and Maren, rumors that had started innocently, almost dismissively, but had begun to grow louder with each passing day. The nobility, never ones to miss an opportunity for gossip, had already started to speculate about the nature of his relationship with the servant girl. The word scandal was on their lips, and Dorian could see it, the way they circled around him, the subtle nudges of advice meant to remind him of his duty to the family name. But it was not just the court that was closing in on him. Maren had become the focal point of a growing uncertainty in his heart, and each glance toward her felt like a betrayal of the world he was supposed to uphold. He saw her in the hallways, in the gardens, moving with grace and purpose, yet each time he looked at her, he felt a tightening in his chest, the crushing weight of what they could never be. She was not meant for his world, not in the way he longed for. And he knew that. He had always known that. Still, he could not seem to let go of the pull toward her, the desire to stand beside her, to defend her from the rumors and the harsh eyes of the court. His hands itched to do something, to make the court see her as he did, not as an object of scorn or scandal, but as a person of worth, someone whose strength and dignity deserved recognition, not punishment. But he could not. The world was watching, and the risk of everything collapsing under the weight of their secret loomed like an ever-present shadow. He was a duke, bound by duty to protect his family's legacy, his name, and his estate. And Maren, beautiful, brilliant, and brave Maren, was a servant, a woman whose future was dictated by the rules of a world she could never escape. No matter how much he wanted to tear down those walls, no matter how much he wanted to be with her, he could not ignore the reality that bound them both. He could not afford to let this happen. Not now, not ever. It was late one evening when Dorian could no longer deny the truth that had been festering in his chest for weeks. The weight of his duty, the burden of his title, had pressed so heavily on him that it felt as though the walls of Ravonsmere itself were closing in. The courtiers' whispers, the demands of his family, the proposals he could no longer ignore, all of it seemed like a distant, suffocating fog, but none of it compared to the weight of Maren. He had spent days, weeks, even months trying to keep his emotions in check, pretending that the way his heart raced when she was near, the way her presence filled the empty spaces within him, didn't matter. He had buried those feelings under layers of duty and expectation, telling himself that he could never have her, that she could never fit into his world. But each time he saw her, each time her quiet strength and intelligence illuminated the room, he was reminded of the impossible truth. He could not live without her. The decision came to him with a sudden clarity, like a breaking wave crashing against the rocks, unstoppable and inevitable. He could not continue this way. He could not continue to be a man torn between duty and desire, between the life he had been born into and the life he longed to claim. Maren was in the gardens that evening, as she so often was, walking slowly along the stone paths, her hands clasped behind her back as she observed the growing flowers, the birds that fluttered between the branches. She moved with a quiet grace, her presence calming the storm inside him, even from a distance. Dorian watched her for a moment from the shadows of the courtyard, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he was about to risk. When she turned to leave the garden, he stepped forward, his movements swift but careful, as though stepping out of some self-imposed prison. He was no longer the Duke of Ravonsmere in that moment. He was simply a man who had finally found the courage to ask for what he wanted. "Maren," he called softly, his voice barely rising above the evening breeze. She turned, startled, her eyes wide as she met his gaze. "Your Grace," she whispered, but her voice was strained, as though she already knew what was coming. He closed the distance between them, his gaze steady, though his heart raced with the uncertainty of what he was about to ask. "I've spent too long telling myself that this," he gestured between them, his voice thick with emotion, "is impossible, but I've realized that I can no longer ignore what's in my heart." Maren swallowed, her breath catching. "I love you," Dorian said, the words breaking free in a rush of truth he could no longer hold back. "And I will not live a life that is incomplete, not without you." Her eyes filled with something too deep for words, and for a moment, Dorian feared she would reject him, that the gulf between their worlds would swallow them both whole. But instead, she stepped forward, her hands trembling as they reached for him. I don't deserve you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm just a servant." Dorian shook his head, cutting her off. "You are everything. You always have been." And as he cupped her face gently in his hands, leaning down to kiss her, he knew that whatever came next, whatever the world said or thought, they would face it together. Because this was their truth. Maren stood on the edge of a precipice, her heart pounding in her chest as the reality of Dorian's words settled over her like a heavy shroud. He loved her. He had just said it, so simply, so completely. And yet the words felt unreal, as though they had been pulled from some impossible dream, not the world she had known. The Duke, the man who had lived in a world of titles, alliances, and duty, had just offered her a place in his life, in his heart. And for the briefest moment, she had believed him, believed that she could step forward into that light without fear, without hesitation. But then, as quickly as the hope had bloomed, fear began to wrap its cold fingers around her heart. The weight of her past, of everything she had always known, rushed back to her with suffocating force. She had spent her entire life hidden in the shadows, resigned to her place as a servant, a woman whose worth was defined by what she could do for others, not who she was. She had never dreamed of being loved, never dared to imagine that someone like Dorian Blackwater, a man of such power, such presence, could ever see her as anything more than a fleeting distraction. Her hands trembled at her sides, and she took a shaky step back, her thoughts spinning out of control. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she was terrified, that she couldn't bear the weight of his love, of the impossible future he was offering her. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by the suffocating walls of doubt that had been built around her heart for so long. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, the words barely audible in the quiet of the garden. "I don't deserve you." Dorian's expression faltered, his brows furrowing slightly, but he stepped forward, reaching for her with a tenderness that made her ache. "Maren, please," he said softly. "You do deserve this. You deserve everything. You've always deserved everything." Her chest tightened, the weight of her past and her fear threatening to crush her. "But I'm just a servant," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm nothing more than that. I don't belong in your world. I don't belong with you." Dorian's hands gently cupped her face, his touch steady and warm, grounding her in the moment. "You belong with me," he said, his voice unwavering. "You are everything I've ever wanted, Maren. Don't you see that?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, the vulnerability too raw, too dangerous. "I'm afraid," she whispered, her voice barely above her breath, "afraid that if I step into this with you, I'll only ruin everything, that I'll never be enough." Dorian's thumb brushed across her cheek, wiping away the first tear that slipped free. "You are more than enough, and I will never let you think otherwise. We'll face everything together, Maren. I won't let you walk this path alone." For a moment, there was only silence, the soft rustling of the trees and the distant hum of the estate filling the space between them. And in that silence, Maren felt the weight of her fear begin to lift, slowly, tentatively. For the first time in her life, she felt the stirring of something she had never known, hope. Hope that, despite everything that stood between them, they might actually have a future, together. But even as the possibility bloomed in her heart, the shadow of doubt remained, lurking just beneath the surface. She wasn't sure if she could be the woman Dorian believed her to be, but she was willing to try. And for the first time in her life, trying felt like enough. Dorian had never imagined his life would come to this, the weight of his decisions pressing so heavily on his chest that it felt as though he could hardly breathe. His entire existence had been defined by duty, by the cold certainty of what was expected of him, and by the walls he had so carefully built around himself. But in the days since his confession to Maren, since the kiss that had shifted everything between them, he found himself standing on the precipice of a choice he had never thought he would make. The court had already begun to whisper. His family had already begun to make their objections clear. Maren's place in his life, her very existence in the grand halls of Ravonsmere, had become the focal point of all his duties, all his responsibilities. And yet, despite the weight of it all, he could not turn away from her. He had tried. He had tried to ignore the pull she had on him, the tenderness he felt in her presence, the way she made him feel more alive than he had ever been before. But every time he saw her, every time their eyes met, it became more impossible to pretend that this love, was anything less than inevitable. And now, standing in the grand hall of Ravonsmere, with his family and his most trusted allies gathered before him, Dorian knew that this was the moment when everything would change. There would be no going back. There would be no more hiding. "I will not marry for politics," he said, his voice steady, unwavering, as he addressed his family and the nobles assembled. "I will not be bound by the expectations of my title, nor will I allow anyone to dictate who I can love." His gaze swept over the room, finding Lady Berenice's cold eyes watching him from the far corner, and he knew that what he was about to do would change everything. "I love Maren Elwood," he continued, his voice louder now, more certain, "and I will not let the world take her from me." The silence that followed was deafening, the room filled with a mix of disbelief and shock. But for Dorian, there was no fear, no hesitation. There was only the clarity of his heart, the certainty that the woman he had chosen was worth every risk, every sacrifice. He had made his stand. The days after Dorian's declaration were filled with uncertainty. the weight of his words still lingering in the air like a silent promise. For Maren, everything felt different. She had known what it was like to be unseen, to move through life with no expectations placed upon her. But now, with Dorian's love laid bare and his promise of a future together, she found herself standing at the threshold of a life she never thought possible. The tension between fear and hope coiled tightly in her chest, and with each passing day, the reality of what he had offered her seemed both thrilling and terrifying. It was in the days that followed his declaration that Maren began to change, though it was not the kind of transformation one could easily see in a mirror. She had always been quiet, her presence barely noticed unless she was working, but now there was a subtle shift in the way she moved, in the way she carried herself. The knowledge that Dorian had chosen her, truly chosen her, began to settle into her bones, a quiet strength blossoming within her that she had never known she possessed. She walked with more purpose, spoke with more conviction, and for the first time in her life, she truly believed that she deserved something more. Yet, even as the realization of what could be between them bloomed in her heart, a flicker of doubt remained. How could she, a servant, stand by his side? How could she enter a world that had always looked down upon people like her? The weight of those questions pressed heavily upon her, and though she tried to push them aside, they refused to be ignored. One afternoon, as Maren worked in the garden, her hands moving absently as she arranged a few stray flowers, she felt Dorian's presence before she saw him. His footsteps were unmistakable, the quiet authority in his stride drawing her attention. When she turned to face him, her heart skipped a beat as she met his gaze, still uncertain but no longer afraid. Dorian smiled, and the world seemed to shift beneath her feet. "You are more than enough, Maren," he said softly, "more than you'll ever realize." And in that moment, she felt it, the faintest whisper of courage blooming within her heart, as if, for the first time, she believed she might be worthy of the love he had given her. Dorian's decision had been made, and there was no turning back. The whispers in the court, the disapproving glances from his family, and the weight of his title, they all meant nothing compared to the pull he felt toward Maren. She was no longer a servant in his eyes, no longer a woman defined by her station, but the one person who had come to matter more than anything else. He stood before his family in the grand hall, the weight of his resolve pressing upon him. His father's eyes bored into him with cold disapproval, and his mother's silence was a sharp contrast to the tension in the room. Yet Dorian stood firm, his heart beating with a steady certainty he had never known. "I will not bend to your will," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I choose her." Maren, standing at the threshold, felt the intensity of his words pierce her, a quiet, undeniable truth unfolding between them. This was the moment that defined them both, not by their pasts, but by the love they had found in each other. Dorian turned to her, his gaze soft but resolute, knowing the world would no longer be able to separate them. The days following Dorian's bold declaration were a blur of preparation, and Maren found herself swept up in a whirlwind of emotions she could barely grasp. His family, though reluctantly, had accepted his decision, and the whispers in the court were shifting, as though the impossible had suddenly become a possibility. Dorian's love for her, though openly declared, still felt fragile, a delicate thing held together by more than just words. In the quiet moments they shared, whether in the garden or by the firelight, Maren could see the weight of it all in his eyes. He had chosen her, yes, but the reality of what that meant, the challenges, the expectations, the cost, hung heavily between them. Yet, as they stood together in the courtyard that evening, Dorian reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm, as though reminding her that, no matter the odds, they would face it together. "You're not alone," he said softly, his voice steady with a promise she had never dared to believe. Maren met his gaze, her heart swelling with emotion, as the world they had known began to fade, replaced by a future neither of them had ever imagined. The night before the official announcement, Maren stood alone in the courtyard, the moonlight casting soft shadows on the ground. The stars above were distant, cold, but tonight, they didn't seem so far away. She had felt fear, hope, and everything in between, but tonight, there was only peace, peace that had eluded her for so long. Dorian's words echoed in her mind, "You're not alone," and somehow, in the silence of the night, those words became her anchor. It wasn't just the promise of his love, but the weight of his loyalty, his willingness to stand beside her against the world. She touched the ring on her finger, a symbol of the future they were about to build, one not defined by her past, but by what they could become together. She felt his presence before he stepped into the garden, his form outlined by the soft glow of the lanterns. "Maren," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet reverence. She turned toward him, her heart steady for the first time in ages, and with a smile that was more certain than any she'd ever given, she nodded. "I'm ready," she whispered. The sun rose over Ravonsmere with a brilliance that matched the quiet joy settling in Maren's heart. Today was the beginning of everything, the day when the past no longer held dominion over her future. Today, she would walk beside Dorian, not as a servant, but as his equal, as the woman he had chosen. The court had been silent when the announcement had been made. There had been no grand celebrations, no fanfare, but as she stood beside him in the grand hall, his hand warm in hers, Maren knew that this moment, the moment she had never dared to dream, was finally here. Dorian turned to her, his eyes soft, but filled with unwavering determination. "This is just the beginning, Maren. We will face everything, together." She nodded, the words she had wanted to say caught in her throat. There was no need for them now. She had already found the strength she never knew she possessed, and in Dorian, she had found the love she had once thought impossible. As they stepped forward, the world seemed to open before them, wide and full of promise, and for the first time, Maren believed that love, true, unwavering love, had found a place to flourish.